This is Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video covers Lectures 1 and 2 of Seminar 7. We finally arrived at the famous Seminar 7. For someone coming to Lacan for the first time, the fact that the work focuses on ethics will undoubtedly be confusing. Not that confusion is unusual when it comes to reading any of the seminars, but the specific confusion here has to do with the fact that the version of ethics being offered sharply diverges from other traditional ethical systems, from Aristotle's virtue ethics to Kant's imperative to the calculus of utilitarianism. Seminar 7 will certainly draw out certain truths in each of these approaches, but at its core, Lacan's ethics revolves around desire, which emerges in the tension between the symbolic and the real. The ethical challenge is to remain faithful to one's desire without succumbing to the illusions of the good or the destructive excesses of a moral masochism. The first two lectures covered in this video will lay some of the groundwork for the kind of ethics Lacan will argue is central to psychoanalysis. As always, these videos are best viewed while reading the text itself. In doing so, you'll be able to enter a conversation between my own understanding and your initial interpretations of the same text, which will elevate your learning far more than merely watching these videos alone. And now to the text. Lacan notes that he is not the first to address the topic of ethics in psychoanalysis, and that the field is submerged in what he calls moral problems. However, he specifies the matter more precisely by homing in on what he identifies as the attraction of transgression of the moral law. The nature of this transgression is not specified here, but a few contenders are mentioned, such as the Freudian myth of the murder of the father, as well as the death drive. And he will add that this transgression is worthy of our praise, felix culpa, or happy fault. The Latin phrase Lacan uses here originates from Christian theology and is often associated with the idea that original sin ultimately led to a greater good, the redemption of humanity through the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Christ. Notably, the French word being translated as transgression here is la faute, which is also the term used to name original sin. For Lacan, however, his meaning is a bit more general, as the transgression he speaks of served as the origin of a higher complexity responsible for the development of civilization. What Lacan is referring to here is the emergence of the superego, wherein the subject will encounter a sense of moral guilt. Psychoanalysis has developed in such a way as to see itself in the role of calming such guilt. However, Lacan warns, analysts must avoid moralizing patients' guilt. Moral experience in psychoanalysis should not be defined in terms of the superego, but instead is rooted in the famed Freudian experience of where it was, there I must come to be. A movement that is opposed to the one that submits to the demands of the superego. From this command, we find the subject must confront the truth of their desire. Now, despite making desire central to his own ethics, Lacan is critical of those Enlightenment-era attempts to liberate desire through reason. These projects failed because they remained trapped within a certain moralism. Sard's erotic defiance of divine authority, for instance, inadvertently reaffirms the law it seeks to transgress. In this case, transgression, Lacan argues, paradoxically reinforces the law by positioning it as the necessary source of desire. Consequently, the Enlightenment's promise to free desire through rationality collapsed into a new moralism, and this can be then in turn seen in what he calls the hygienic ideals of psychoanalysis itself, namely the ideal of human or genital love, the ideal of authenticity, and the ideal of independence. So in this example, we can see how desire and its satisfactions exhibit a complicated relationship when it concerns pleasure. The subject's relationship to satisfaction is neither simple nor unambiguous. Instead, desire operates as desire of the other's desire, a second-order desire that generates paradoxical satisfactions, manifesting in what Lacan identifies as moral masochism and producing a perverse enjoyment in suffering. In Lecture 2, Lacan presents his thesis that the moral law structured by the symbolic is that through which the real is actualized, the real as such, the weight of the real. Lacan explains that the moral law is affirmed in opposition to pleasure, and in connecting it to the real, moves the moral law outside of its typical position as an ideal. So, what is the meaning of the real? To begin addressing such a challenging question, Lacan brings up the opposition found in Freud between the pleasure principle and the reality principle, but then turns to the beyond of the pleasure principle, leading us to the death drive. We'll say more about the reality and pleasure principles in just a little bit, but what Lacan seems to be doing in this portion of the text is linking the real with the death drive, a move that would seem to depart from how he formulated it in Seminar 2, where it seems clearly positioned in the register of the symbolic. We'll have to keep an eye out for whether this is truly a contradiction of his past statements or not. Lacan calls the death drive here a law beyond all law, a final structure and a vanishing point of any reality that might be attained. It emerges out of the conflict between pleasure and reality principles. Now, given the situating of the death drive in the register of the real, along with the pairing of the moral law with the superego, we can turn back to that quote that I read earlier and perhaps instead say the superego, structured by the symbolic, is that through which the death drive is actualized. Such an interpretation of what Lacan says here would align with Freud's own statement, where in The Ego and the Id, Freud writes that a pure culture of the death drive governs the superego, suggesting that the death drive operates in an unrestrained and isolated form within the superego, amplifying its destructive potential. Lacan will then claim that ethical action is grafted onto the real, and that it introduces something new into the real. We'll learn more about what that is, but instead of elaborating on the meaning of this here, he goes on to indicate that what psychoanalysis does is it prepares subjects for taking such action by clearing a path. But it remains a preliminary to ethical action, always stopping short at the threshold of the real. I want to highlight something here that since the juxtapositioning of ethical and moral action and moral law at first glance appears contradictory. It will be an idea that we'll be unpacking over time, but some preliminary thoughts around this may help to begin to make sense of it. When we hear moral law, we should think superego, as I already said. And when we hear ethical action, we should think desire. To act ethically, then, is not to affirm the moral law, but, as we'll later see, to act in accordance with one's desire. But a desire, as Lacan understands it, is that which is repressed through the superego's imposition of the moral law. Then acting in accordance with it means to transgress the moral law. But then again, in turn, it is the moral law which evokes a desire for its very transgression. And thus, in such a situation, it would be necessary to support the law for the possibility of such desire, as we just heard about when it came to the Enlightenment era attempts at liberating desire. The goal in laying all this out is not to render it clear yet. only to demonstrate the landscape of problems and paradoxes that we'll be working through over the course of these videos that are covering Seminar 7. Lacan will then transition to Aristotle. For Aristotle, ethics is teleological. Virtue aligns human action with the sovereign good, a divine natural ideal embedded in the cosmic order. This alignment is achieved through habituation, training the subject to internalize the orthos logos, the right reason or right discourse, a kind of rational calculus for discerning virtual acts in specific situations. Now, contrasting this with psychoanalysis, in psychoanalysis, the truth that it's focused on is not some sovereign good, but is a particular truth pertaining to the subject's desire, which is discussed here and left in the German in terms of Freud's notion of Wunsch, which is often translated as unconscious wish, but can also be rendered here desire. And the Wunsch begins with a radical particularity. It's not a universal law, but a singular regressive force embedded in the subject's psychic structure. The Wunsch operates in a dimension Lacan identifies as infantile and unrealistic, a primordial mode of thought preserved in the unconscious and masked by the veneer of adult rationality. Lacan cites the romantic adage by Wordsworth here, the child is father to the man. This is not meant to be some kind of sentimental metaphor, but a Freudian truth. Adult thought is structured by an archaic unconscious logic that persists beneath and through conscious, supposedly mature thought. This duality, here presented in terms of child and man, manifests in Freud's distinction between the primary process, governed by the pleasure principle, and the secondary process, regulated by the reality principle. The primary process pursues immediate discharge of tension through hallucinatory wish fulfillments. It is identified as a principle of inertia, since its objective is not pleasure so much, despite its name, but instead the cessation of the pursuit of pleasure. And hence why elsewhere it's called sometimes the unpleasure principle. The reality principle, and there's a question here as to what we mean by reality, because there's two kinds of reality being discussed in this chapter. There's the reality as a socio-symbolic construction, and then there's the real, which is always something outside of the symbolic. But the reality principle itself emerges as a correction mechanism that interrupts the inertia of the pleasure principle, forcing the mind to adapt to external conditions. Now, toward the end of Lecture 2, Lacan introduces a mini schema aimed at illustrating and summarizing dialectical tension between pleasure principle and reality principle. There are a few things worth pointing out here. It should be noted that in this diagram, the good is located on the side of the pleasure principle. And this would coincide with those ethical philosophies that put forth the compatibility between goodness and the experience of pleasure, that we enjoy what is good. However, where Lacan deviates from this tradition is to show how the good is not compatible with reality, or perhaps more accurately, the notion of the good which functions only as a signifier that comes into reality through language is itself not the extra-linguistic substance of the real. So what is left here instead is a question mark. And Lacan will spend the rest of the seminar attempting to explain how what belongs here is what lies beyond the good, in the real. And it will be this real thing that one discerns in Freud's reality principle that will figure centrally in the lectures to come. Thank you for making it to the end. If you got something out of this and want to continue supporting this work, you can do so through liking the video, sharing it with others, and if you haven't already, subscribing to the channel. You can also support this work in other ways through the Super Thanks button here on YouTube, or you can become a Patreon supporter where I offer video transcripts, unedited materials, prioritize questions and comments here on YouTube, and put up some of the diagrams that I use in these videos. The link is below. I would like to thank the following for already supporting this work over on Patreon. And until next time, be well.